Holden Barrett arrived at Mercer Sterling Motors in work clothes, grease still faint under his fingernails, standing among men in expensive suits who looked through him rather than at him. Celeste Mercer, acting CEO of one of the most formidable automotive dynasties on the East Coast, stared across that private garage and let a cold smile settle on her face. "Fix this old Rolls-Royce," she said, loud enough for the entire board to hear, "and the company's yours." She was certain it was safe. The car had been dead for 17 years, and every specialist she had paid had walked away empty-handed. But Holden, crouched beside it, listened for 3 seconds, made one small adjustment beneath the hood, and the engine answered. Stay until the end, because that engine did not just start. It unlocked the real will of an entire empire. Barrett Classic Works occupied a corner of a long industrial strip on the south side of Boston, 3 bays wide. A concrete floor darkened by years of oil, and a hand-lettered sign above the roll-up doors that Holden had painted himself when he opened the place 6 years earlier. The walls held tools on pegboard, calendars from auto parts suppliers, and between the second and third bay, a row of crayon drawings, detailed, surprisingly accurate renderings of classic cars made by a 9-year-old who had learned the difference between a silver cloud and a silver shadow before she learned her multiplication tables. Holden had framed 2 of them. The others he rotated. On the morning that would change everything, Holden was on his back beneath a 1952 Packard Clipper, working a rusted exhaust, fitting loose with a breaker bar, and the particular patience that only develops in people who have spent years listening to things that refuse to cooperate. His daughter Maddie sat nearby on an overturned milk crate doing homework, her backpack propped against a tire. They had a routine. Holden worked, Maddie worked beside him, and around 11 one of them made sandwiches. And the routine was the whole point. He could hear her breathing. That had been enough for 6 years. Holden had not always worked in a 3-bay garage. Before Maddie was born, and before her mother Claire got sick, he had been recruited twice by restoration shops in New England that charged 6 figures per project and kept 3-year waiting lists. He had turned them both down, and then Claire had gotten sick, and then she was gone, and the question of where to work had become less interesting than the question of how to stay close to the child who needed him. The garage suited that arrangement. Maddie could sit on the crate. She could draw on the walls. It was a quiet life, and he had built it deliberately. A regular customer named Roy Finch, a retired contractor who brought Holden a 1968 Mustang Fastback every spring for preventive work, asked once why a man with Holden's gifts was running 3 bays instead of consulting for one of the major marques. Holden handed back the keys and said he liked being somewhere his daughter could sit with him. Roy laughed and did not follow up, which was the right response. It was on a Wednesday in early April that Rhett Calloway came through the door. Rhett was in his late 60s, white-haired, still carrying himself with the careful posture of a man who had spent many years opening doors for other people. Holden recognized him from a photograph his father had kept in a shoebox on the bedroom closet shelf. Rhett standing beside a gleaming car on a gravel drive, squinting into the sun with the proprietary pride of a man trusted to care for something valuable. Rhett said he needed a favor, someone to look at a 1956 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud that had not run in 17 years, housed in a private garage at a company called Mercer Sterling Motors in Back Bay. Holden started to decline. He wanted nothing to do with the kind of institution that employed men in suits and paid them to tell everyone below them what the rules were. Then Rhett said, "Your father used to work on that car." Holden put down the breaker bar. Mercer Sterling Motors occupied 4 floors of glass and brushed steel in Back Bay, with a showroom on the ground level and a lobby that communicated with considerable success that the people who walked through it were expected to have significant money and know what to do with it. The company had been founded 31 years earlier by a man named Sterling Mercer, on the conviction that serious buyers of serious automobiles deserved to feel that their cars had been touched by people who cared. The restoration workshop in Dedham, 17 craftsmen who could rebuild a carburetor from its components and tell you exactly what the original assembler had done wrong, had been Sterling's particular obsession, and for most of the company's life, it had been its soul. Sterling Mercer had died 14 months earlier, quietly, in the study of his home in Weston, with a cup of tea on the desk that had gone cold before anyone found him. He had left no clear final will. The document filed with his estate attorney gave his daughter Celeste acting control of the company with limited authority, and gave his nephew Vaughn Mercer financial veto power over major transactions. Neither of them was satisfied with this arrangement, and neither of them said so directly, which is the kind of politeness that has teeth. Celeste was 35 and had been running the company for 14 months, with the controlled, slightly ferocious energy of someone who feels the ground shifting beneath them and refuses to look down. She had restructured the sales operation, brought in 2 institutional investors, and done what was necessary to keep the balance sheet readable. She was not wrong that the restoration workshop cost more than it earned on a quarterly basis. She was possibly wrong about what that cost actually meant. Vaughn Mercer was 42 and had been at the company 9 years, long enough to know where every document lived and whose number every board member had saved. He was pleasant in meetings and difficult after them, which is the most effective possible combination in a corporate environment, and he had spent the preceding 6 months preparing a restructuring proposal. Close the restoration workshop, license the brand to a third-party dealer network, shift capital into autonomous vehicle leasing products. The numbers were clean. The question of what the numbers were missing was one he did not ask himself. There was a standing problem with the estate, and everyone around the company knew it, and no one addressed it directly. Sterling's final will had never been found. The document on file was a draft from 4 years before his death, and Celeste's own attorney had told her privately that Sterling had almost certainly written something more recent. But the search of his home and personal files had produced nothing. Rhett Calloway, who had been Sterling's driver and something closer than that for 22 years, had told Celeste once that her father used to say the answer was in the rolls. Celeste had thought this was the kind of thing an old man says about the thing he loves most, romantic and opaque and ultimately not useful. She had thanked Rhett and moved on. Vaughn had been standing near the window during that conversation. He had gone quiet afterward and excused himself early from dinner. No one had thought much about that at the time. The drive to Back Bay from Roslindale took 40 minutes in light traffic, and Holden spent most of it thinking about the shoebox on the shelf in his father's bedroom closet, the one he had never fully gone through because opening it felt like a door closing rather than one opening. His father, Gary Barrett, had died 8 years ago in the way men who have spent their lives working with their hands sometimes die, quietly, without ceremony, leaving behind tools and a small apartment and a reputation among everyone who knew him as a man whose word was complete. Mercer Sterling Motors was not what he had expected. He had expected a dealership. What he found was closer to a financial institution that happened to sell vehicles, a building that expressed in architecture what it believed about its own importance. The receptionist at the front desk looked at his work shirt, looked at the canvas bag on his shoulder, and had already begun redirecting him toward the service entrance when Rhett appeared at her elbow and said, quietly, that Mr. Barrett was expected. The look she gave Holden as Rhett led him toward the elevator was not hostile, only puzzled, the expression of someone encountering something that does not fit the available categories. They descended to the basement level, and the temperature dropped several degrees as the elevator doors opened on the private garage. The lighting was warm and slightly amber, the kind produced by fixtures that have been accumulating dust for years. And at the center of the space, under a canvas cover that Rhett pulled back with both hands and something near reverence, was the car. A 1956 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, coachwork in silver gray that had deepened over the years to the color of old pewter. The chrome brightwork oxidized to a dull haze, but the lines beneath still carrying the quality that defined British coachwork from the middle of the last century. The quality of something built slowly by people who believed they would be judged by it long after they were gone. Holden walked around it once without speaking. He rested 2 fingers lightly on the coachwork, behind the rear wheel arch, and stood there for a moment, not examining anything specific, just present. Then he crouched near the front left corner of the hood, and he looked, and he went very still. Along the bottom edge of the hood frame, close to the hinge, were 2 small marks. Horizontal scratches, precisely spaced, about a thumbnail apart, made with the tip of a screwdriver or something similar. They were the kind of marks that would mean nothing to anyone who had not seen them before, in the same precise form on other cars. His father had made that mark on every vehicle he serviced for 35 years. 2 scratches near the primary hinge, Gary Barrett's notation that the initial inspection was complete. Holden had watched him make it on 36 cars in that 3-bay garage in Roslindale. He was looking at it now. He stood up and turned to Rhett. He asked how much his father had worked on this car. Rhett said, "A great deal more than anyone told you." The garage was quiet. The silver cloud sat under the amber light and waited, the same way it had been waiting for 17 years, for someone who understood it well enough to ask the right question. The meeting that had been scheduled for that afternoon on the 3rd floor was relocated, at Celeste's direction, to the basement garage. She said it was efficient. What she meant was that she wanted an audience when she settled the question of the restoration division, and a mechanic from a 3-bay shop in Roslindale confirming what 3 previous specialists had already established served her purpose cleanly in either outcome. 7 people came down with her. 3 board members, Vaughn Mercer, Cassidy Monroe from Communications, an institutional investor named Warren Hale who happened to be in the building that afternoon, and Preston Tate, who served as outside counsel to Vaughn, and who had a way of positioning himself slightly behind whoever he was working for that Holden found immediately legible. They arranged themselves at a comfortable distance from the car, which is what people do when they have decided in advance to be spectators rather than participants. Vaughn was talking, before he had fully entered the room, already narrating events that had not yet occurred. Explaining that it was good the board could see this directly, that independent eyes on the vehicle would protect against any future suggestion that the assessment had been inadequate. He said this without looking at Holden, which Holden noted. Cassidy Monroe glanced at Holden's work shirt, then at Celeste, and said something too quiet to hear. Celeste's expression did not change. Holden asked for quiet and time to do a proper inspection before any attempt at the ignition. This was a reasonable request and also, in this particular room, a mild act of defiance, because Vaughn had already implied that any competent professional should be capable of quick judgment. Holden did not offer quick judgments. He opened the hood and spent 12 minutes in the engine compartment with a flashlight and a telescoping inspection mirror. He was not slow. He was reading. Vaughn said to no one in particular, "Every specialist we've paid has reached the same conclusion. I'm not sure what makes our friend from Roslindale different, unless he has some particular gift for things other people have given up on." 2 board members smiled. Warren Hale looked at the car. Holden closed the hood. He looked at Celeste Mercer directly, which was the first time in 40 minutes he had done so. She was 35 and carried herself with a composed authority that looks effortless from a distance and, up close, reveals the effort it costs. She looked back with the calm of someone who has decided the outcome of a meeting before it begins. "Fix this old Rolls-Royce," she said, with the edge of something that was not quite laughter, "and the company's yours." She said it loudly enough for everyone to hear, with the confidence of a woman offering a bet she cannot lose. The board members registered it as a joke. Vaughn's expression confirmed it. Holden reached into his breast pocket. The room expected a tool or a rebuttal. What he produced was a small photograph, worn at the corners, which he looked at for a moment and returned without explanation. Then he looked at Celeste and spoke in the same even tone he used to describe what was wrong with an engine. "Do you want me to fix it?" he said. "Or do you want one more reason to let it go?" He said it without challenge, without theater, a mechanic's question, because the answer mattered to the work. The room was quiet enough that Celeste heard something in it she had not prepared for. She did not answer, but she did not tell him to stop. Holden asked Rhett to sit in the driver's seat and attempt the ignition on his instruction. The key went in. Rhett turned it. What came back was a single dry click, a faint vibration in the fuel line that was not a pump cycle but the echo of one, and then silence. Holden had his hand resting lightly on the fender near the battery terminal, and he felt what there was to feel, and he already knew the shape of what he was looking at. He returned to the engine compartment and went directly to a specific location: the distributor cap and the ignition advance mechanism on the left side of the block. What he found there was not damage. Damage would have been straightforward. What he found was adjustment. A deliberate transposition of two terminal leads on the ignition advance that would have looked, on any standard inspection checklist, exactly like the factory configuration. It was only wrong if you knew the 1956 Silver Cloud's ignition geometry well enough to recognize that the second and fourth terminals had been swapped after the car had last run, and that swapped in precisely that combination. The result was a timing mismatch that prevented ignition without leaving any visible evidence of interference. It was, Holden thought, genuinely skilled work, the kind done by someone who understood engines well enough to make one stop without appearing to have touched it. He corrected the terminals. He cleaned the distributor cap contact surfaces, checked the spark plug leads for resistance, located a secondary fuel shutoff beneath the dashboard that had been set to restrict rather than cut, and turned it to the correct position. He called out for a fuel type by the original British specification, and Rhett, without comment, went to the back of a service cabinet along the wall and returned with a sealed can that had apparently been waiting there for exactly this. Holden topped the reservoir, checked the choke, and stood back. Vaughn said that 3 licensed specialists had assessed this engine bay and found nothing actionable, and that whatever Holden was attempting to charge the family for parts and labor on a vehicle professionally assessed as non-operational was a conversation the company's legal team would want to be part of. Holden did not look at him. He said, without raising his voice, "This car didn't die. Someone made it stay still." He placed the observation in the room the way a mechanic places a fact, directly, without argument, for whoever wanted to pick it up. The garage went quiet. Celeste was looking at the car. Rhett had both hands on the steering wheel. Holden said, "Try the key." Rhett turned it. There was a hesitation, the kind old things produce when they have been away a long time and are not quite certain the world still has room for them. And then the engine of the 1956 Silver Cloud exhaled and caught and came alive. The sound it made was not the aggressive roar that appears in films. It was deeper and slower, a warm, resonant mechanical voice that filled the garage from the floor upward, even and unhurried, the sound of something built to last, running exactly the way it was built to run. Rhett Calloway bowed his head over the steering wheel, and his shoulders moved in a way that made clear he was crying, and he felt no need to explain or conceal it. The board members who had been smiling 7 minutes earlier were not smiling. Warren Hale took one step toward the car. Cassidy Monroe stood very still. Celeste Mercer had both hands at her sides, and whatever careful expression she had constructed for the afternoon was gone, and what replaced it was complicated in the way things are complicated when they have been held below the surface for 14 months. Von Mercer's complexion had changed. The confident color had left it. He was looking at the open engine compartment with the focused expression of a man running a calculation under serious pressure. And then, from beneath the walnut dashboard panel, as the engine idled and its heat began to fill the cold garage with something almost like warmth, there was a sound. A soft pneumatic release, a mechanism activating, and a narrow panel in the lower dashboard fascia moved 3/4 of an inch outward. A hidden compartment, open for the first time in 17 years. Holden did not reach in. He looked at Celeste. Whatever else this was, it was her family's car and her family's business, and the thing inside it was addressed to her in ways he could not yet fully understand. Celeste came forward and crouched beside the open panel. What was inside? A flat leather case, dark brown, the size of a hardback book, with the initials SM pressed into the lower right corner. A small brass key on a ring, the type used for mid-century American lockboxes. A cylinder of magnetic tape in a protective sleeve labeled in ballpoint pen with a date 14 months and 12 days before Sterling Mercer had died, and a sealed cream envelope with the name Celeste written on the front in a hand she recognized without being told whose it was. Rhett had cut the engine. The garage was quiet. Celeste held the envelope in both hands without opening it. Vaughn said, quickly, that any documents found on company property were subject to board review before individual access. Preston Tate stepped forward as if to second this. Tessa Holloway, who had been standing near the garage entrance for the previous 20 minutes, and whom no one except Rhett and Holden had invited, said, with the specific calm of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment, that under applicable estate law, a sealed document bearing a personal salutation, found in the decedent's vehicle at the time of discovery, constituted personal correspondence rather than corporate property, and that any attempt to intercept it would expose the intercepting party to civil liability she was prepared to enumerate at considerable length. Preston looked at Tessa. Tessa looked back. Vaughn said nothing further. Celeste opened the envelope. The letter from Sterling Mercer was 3 pages, written by hand in the careful script of a man who believed the written word was more honest than the spoken one. He told Celeste he had hidden this compartment because he did not trust the building and did not trust certain people in it. He said he had designed the mechanism with the help of a man named Gary Barrett, the best mechanic he had ever known and the only person outside the family he had ever fully trusted with the car. He said he had introduced a second layer of protection into the ignition so that the compartment would only release when the engine was started by someone who understood the car well enough to correct what was wrong with it. He wrote, "If you are reading this, someone started the engine. That means someone was honest enough to fix what was broken rather than give up. And I have been waiting 17 years for that person to arrive." He said, "The real will is in the lockbox. The key is here with this letter. Do not let Vaughn open it." He explained why. Holden was reading over Celeste's shoulder, not deliberately, but because the letter was long and the words were large enough. He stopped at the bottom of the second page, where a note had been added in a different pen, smaller, more compressed, written at a later time. It read, "Barrett checked the lock. Truth safe inside." He would have known that handwriting in a photograph taken from the bottom of the sea. He had grown up watching those letters form on birthday cards and shop receipts, and the backs of postcards mailed from every garage father had ever worked in. He stood very still. He said nothing. There was nothing yet that needed to be said. Von Mercer moved first. He told the security staff who had accompanied the board downstairs that no one was to leave with the documents until the company's legal team had reviewed them. A statement Preston Tate immediately seconded, and which produced a room full of people trying to determine the relevant jurisdiction. Holden noted that Vaughn had not asked what was in the letter. A person who did not know what was in it might reasonably have asked. Tessa Holloway produced her bar card and professional identification simultaneously, in the manner of someone who has been in rooms like this before, and said she was present as an independent legal witness on behalf of the Barrett and Mercer families, and that any detention or coercion of individuals in possession of estate documents would be actionable under 3 statutes she was prepared to name. Vaughn said she had not been invited. Tessa said, "Estates do not send invitations." The security staff looked at Vaughn. Vaughn looked at Preston. Preston said, "Let's all take a breath." Celeste had said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, long enough that Cassidy Monroe had looked at her twice with professional concern. Then Celeste turned to Vaughn and said, very evenly, "Why are you panicking?" She said it the way a person asks something they already know the answer to, which is the most unnerving possible form of a question. Holden had gone back to the car. He was examining the driver's side door jamb with a flashlight, then the interior lower edge of the dashboard near the hidden compartment, then a series of marks around the release mechanism he had not examined before because there had been no reason to. There was a reason now. Someone had tried to open the compartment without starting the engine. They had probed the mechanism from the interior and attempted to access the release from behind the lower dashboard, and they had not succeeded. But in the attempt, they had altered the connection between the ignition advance and the release trigger in a way that required the ignition to be corrected before the compartment would respond. The timing transposition that had kept the car silent for 17 years was not a separate act of sabotage. It was a side effect of the attempt to get at what was inside. Holden straightened up and said to the room without particular emphasis, "Whoever tried to get into this compartment is the same person who kept this car from running." A mechanic's assessment in a mechanic's voice. The room received it the way rooms receive something that rearranges what everyone thought they understood. Rhett Calloway looked at Vaughn with the expression of a man whose 14 months of quiet suspicion had just been given a precise shape. Celeste told Preston Tate that she was calling an independent notary to the building within the hour, that the tape, the key, and the leather case would be secured in a neutral location pending verification, and that anyone who objected should explain their objection in writing to the independent trustee she was appointing effective that afternoon. Preston opened his mouth and closed it again. Vaughn's jaw was working, but nothing came out. He had built his position on 3 assumptions: that the car would never start, that the compartment would never open, and that the letter would never be read. And all 3 had failed in the same 2 hours, and he was now a man standing on ice that has already cracked, still deciding whether to run. The independent notary arrived at 5:15. By 5:40, the group, reduced to Celeste, Holden, Rhett, Tessa, Vaughn, and Preston Tate, with 2 neutral witnesses, was seated in a conference room at Harmon and Slade, an estate law firm on Tremont Street whose associate, a composed woman named Naomi Pierce, had rearranged her evening without apparent difficulty. The leather case sat at the center of the table. The tape cylinder sat beside it in its sleeve. The brass key rested on a cloth napkin Naomi Pierce had provided. Tessa requested the recording be played before the lockbox was opened, arguing that an oral statement from the decedent would provide context for the written document. Preston objected that the authentication had not been established. Naomi Pierce said authentication could be provisional. Preston objected to that as well. Celeste said, "Play the tape." Sterling Mercer's voice in the recording was slower and more measured than most of the people in the room had known it in life. The voice of a man choosing his words carefully because he understood this might be the final version of himself that others consulted. He said he was well. He gave the date. He said he was making the recording because he did not trust the conditions under which a written will might eventually be read. He said that Vaughn Mercer had been identified, through the work of an independent financial investigator, as having moved $11 million in company assets into accounts controlled by shell corporations in which Vaughn held concealed interests, and that documentation had been provided under sealed instruction to Naomi Pierce. He said he had considered confronting Vaughn directly and decided against it, because men who have moved $11 million do not respond to confrontation by confessing and returning the money. He said, "I love this company the way you love something you built from nothing, which means I love its bones more than its balance sheet. The restoration workshop is the bones." He said, "The will in the lockbox gives Celeste full authority. There are 2 conditions. She must retain the restoration operation for no fewer than 10 years, and she must honor a bequest to the Barrett family, specifically to Gary Barrett or his lawful heir, of 15% of the non-voting preferential shares in Mercer Sterling Motors as recognition of a debt of trust that cannot be repaid in any other currency." The room was quiet for the length of time it takes a statement to settle into its full meaning. Vaughn's face had completed a journey from calculation to pallor to the specific blankness that settles on people when they understand that what they have done is no longer private. Preston Tate had stopped writing on his legal pad. Warren Hale, given a seat at Naomi Pierce's invitation, looked at the table. Holden looked at the tape cylinder. He thought about his father, the shoebox, the photograph, the 2 scratch marks on the hood hinge, and he thought about a man who had been given a secret that could have made him comfortable and had not sold it, had gone home to a small apartment in Roslindale and raised his son in a 3-bay garage and said nothing for the rest of his life. The lockbox opened on the 3rd attempt. The lock was stiff from years in storage, and inside was the will. 22 pages, formally executed, notarized by Naomi Pierce's predecessor, dated 11 months and 4 days before Sterling Mercer's death. It said everything the recording had said it would say. 15% of the preferential shares, in the name of Gary Barrett or his lawful heir. The heir was Holden. The shares came with a seat on the Restoration Advisory Council and a consultative vote on any decision affecting the workshop. Vaughn said he would contest the will on grounds of diminished capacity. Tessa said the sealed file Naomi Pierce was now opening would make that difficult. The file included 3 physicians' affidavits, 2 independent witness statements, and a notarized statement from a retired federal judge certifying Sterling Mercer's cognitive competence at the time of signing. Sterling had prepared for the argument. He had built around it the same way he had built the hidden compartment, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Holden drove home to Roslindale alone that night, past the street lamps on the Arborway and the corner store where Maddie picked out her cereal on Saturday mornings. He sat in the kitchen for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee that went cold while he looked at the wall above the stove, where his father's old journeyman certificate was framed in the cheap black frame Holden had bought the year after the funeral. Gary Barrett, certified automotive restoration specialist. The date on the certificate was the same year Holden was born. He brought the shoebox to the kitchen table. There were photographs. Gary Barrett at various ages, in various garages, standing beside various cars, with the proprietary affection of people who have spent long hours making something work. There was one he had not registered before. His father in a garage he did not recognize, standing beside Sterling Mercer, both of them looking at the camera with the quiet satisfaction of people who have just finished something they are proud of. The silver cloud was behind them, newly restored, its chrome bright under shop lights. His father had one hand on the hood. Sterling Mercer had one hand on his father's shoulder. There were letters as well, held by a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when Holden touched it. Most were brief: invoices, receipts, work order notes. One was longer, on Mercer Sterling letterhead, dated 3 years before Holden was born. In it, Sterling thanked Gary Barrett for the Silver Cloud restoration and extended a formal offer: a permanent position as head of restoration services. A second page, added later in different ink, acknowledged that Sterling understood Gary's reasons for declining and respected them, and that the arrangement they had discussed, not described but called simply our understanding, remained in force. Rhett had called on the drive home and filled in what the letters could not. Gary Barrett had declined Sterling's offer because of Vaughn, who had already been at the company 5 years and whose character Gary had assessed quickly and correctly. Gary had told Sterling, "I don't want to work for a company that man will someday run." Sterling had said, "Then help me make sure he doesn't." So Gary had helped design the compartment in the Silver Cloud, set the locking mechanism, noted his work in the margin of Sterling's personal letter, and gone home to Roslindale and kept it to himself for the rest of his life. Holden called Maddie in from her room. She sat cross-legged in her chair across from him, and he told her what she needed to know in the version a 9-year-old could carry: that her grandfather had done something important a long time ago, something honest and difficult, and that it had mattered enough that people were still feeling it today. Maddie thought about this. She asked if they were going to be rich. Holden considered the question seriously, the only way he knew how to take her questions. He said, "Probably a little more comfortable than before. But more important than that," he said, "is that your grandfather was not a coward when it counted." Maddie appeared to find this satisfactory. She went back to her room and added a silver cloud to the series of drawings on her wall, working from memory with a determination that reminded Holden, not for the first time, of his father. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 o'clock the following Thursday. Vaughn Mercer had 8 days to build his counter-argument. Tessa Holloway had 8 days to build the case against it. The difference in their preparation showed from the first minute. Tessa arrived with a binder thicker than the printed agenda and an assistant who set up a projection system, while Naomi Pierce distributed authenticated copies of the will and the financial investigation file. Preston Tate arrived with a yellow legal pad and the expression of a man who knows his position has been undermined but has not yet decided to say so. Vaughn opened by arguing that no document produced under these circumstances, retrieved from a vehicle of uncertain condition by a person with no standing in the company, could be considered properly authenticated without independent review. He said the tape could have been altered. He said Sterling's final months had been marked by significant personal stress that might have affected his judgment. He said he was not making accusations, only raising questions the board owed the company. He said all of it with the measured composure of a rehearsed man, and 2 board members nodded because the argument had organizational logic, the kind of logic that survives until someone looks at it closely. Tessa looked at it closely. She walked through the authentication chain, the notarization date, the physician's affidavits, the voice analysis completed in 6 days by a firm whose credentials she provided, the forensic accountant's report on 11 shell accounts, the documented chain of asset transfers beginning 27 months earlier and ending with a movement executed 48 hours before Sterling Mercer died. She used the word fraudulent twice, without raising her voice. She noted that any challenge to the will would require discovery proceedings that would place the financial investigation file in the public record. Preston Tate wrote something on his legal pad and put his pen down. Holden had been asked by Celeste whether he wished to attend and had said yes in the tone he used for things he understood the importance of and did not particularly want to do. He wore a clean shirt. He sat at the end of the table near Rhett, in the chair farthest from Vaughn, and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. Several board members glanced at him during Tessa's presentation with the expression of people quietly revising a prior judgment without wishing to acknowledge it. Warren Hale did not glance at him. Hale watched him steadily from across the table, the closed look of someone deciding something. When Celeste invited Holden to address the board, he stood up. He had nothing prepared. He looked at the people at the table and said, "I'm not here to take anything from anyone. I came because a car had been kept quiet for 17 years, and I couldn't leave it that way. I think this company has been kept quiet in some of the same ways." He paused. "My father trusted that the right person would eventually fix what was wrong. I don't know if I'm the right person for much else, but I know how to listen to something that isn't running the way it should. I'm willing to do that here if it's useful." He sat down. Rhett had both hands flat on the table in front of him. Celeste was looking at Holden. Warren Hale made a note. The vote to suspend Von Mercer pending a full financial audit was 6-1, the dissenting vote being Preston Tate, whose vote, Naomi Pierce clarified without ceremony, was advisory rather than binding. Vaughn left the building that afternoon with the company's compliance officer, and the financial investigator Tessa had retained, both of whom had questions they wished to ask in a recorded environment. He did not speak on his way out. He had the look of a man who had been running a long calculation and had finally reached the last line. Before the building cleared, Celeste sent Cassidy Monroe a single message: cancel the announcement of the restoration workshop closure. Then she called Frank Lattimore, the workshop manager in Dedham, who had spent 3 months quietly preparing his team for news he did not want to deliver. She told him the workshop was staying open. Frank said, "I'll tell the guys." There was a quality in his voice that belongs specifically to relief that has been held in compression for a long time and has finally been allowed to expand. 3 days after the board meeting, Celeste found Holden in the basement garage. He had brought tools from Barrett Classic Works and was working through the maintenance the Silver Cloud needed now that it was running again. Reseating a valve cover gasket, dried by years of disuse, checking the wheel bearings, going through the cooling system with the patience of a man who understands that an engine started, after 17 years, has not yet been fully trusted. He was working alone. The garage was quiet. Celeste came in and stood near the car without immediately saying what she had come to say. She had brought 2 cups of coffee from the cafe upstairs, which was either a gesture or a way of having something to hold. She offered one. He took it and set it on the workbench. She watched him work. Then she said, "I owe you an apology." He waited. "I said something in this room," she said, "that I said because I was certain I couldn't lose. I didn't think about what it communicated about how I saw you. I'm sorry for that." Holden straightened up and looked at her. "You're not the first person to look at what's on my hands before they look at my face," he said. "I stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago." He said it without bitterness, which made it land differently than bitterness would have. "But you're going to be managing people. Some of them will be better at the work than they are at looking like they belong in your room. I hope you'll look at them with your eyes open. Not for my sake. This is already done for me. For theirs." Celeste was quiet for a moment. She said she had been running from her father's version of the company since the day he died, because from where she stood, it felt like a monument to someone else's priorities that she had been left to maintain without being given the authority to change. She had wanted to prove she could build something of her own. She had mistaken dismantling for building. Holden did not say anything to this. He listened the way he listened to engines, without interruption, letting the thing express itself at its own pace. She asked what he intended to do with his shares. He said what seemed right was to use the position not for income but for establishment, a training program based partly out of the Dedham workshop and partly in partnership with a vocational school in Roxbury he had been connected with for 3 years. That would give young people from working neighborhoods a real path into automotive restoration. He said he thought it should be called the Barrett Mercer Restoration Academy. Not because he needed his name on anything, but because the story of how it came to exist was part of what it was teaching. That technical knowledge passed honestly from one pair of hands to another was a form of inheritance that could not be taken by anyone who did not understand what they were holding. Celeste said she would put it to the board with her recommendation. She said she was confident in the outcome. She was leaving when she stopped at the door without turning and said, "The first time her father let her sit in this car, she was 6 years old. He started the engine and she thought the whole building was purring. She stopped there and went back up the stairs. Holden turned back to the valve cover, and the garage was quiet, and the silver cloud sat ready in a way it had not been for a very long time. By the time the leaves changed and the first cold came off the harbor, Mercer Sterling Motors had changed in ways that showed in the building itself. The workshop in Dedham had 3 new apprentices, a Restoration Commission waiting list grown to 18 months, and a glass-fronted display case in the lobby holding tools and photographs from the company's founding years that Sterling Mercer had kept in storage because no one had thought to ask for them. The photograph on the left side of the case showed Sterling and Gary Barrett standing beside the silver cloud under bright shop lights, both of them looking at the camera with the quiet satisfaction of people who have just finished something they are proud of. Nobody moved it. Von Mercer's situation was resolved through channels that move less dramatically than a board meeting. The financial investigation produced its report. The report was referred to the appropriate authorities, and Preston Tate declined to represent him in the resulting proceedings, apparently after reading the forensic accountant's summary a second time. The board appointed a new chief financial officer in October, a woman named Brooke Ellis, who had spent 12 years in automotive finance, and who, on her first day, read the restoration workshop's ledgers and said the margins were acceptable if you accepted that some things have value that does not appear in quarterly numbers. Celeste liked her from the first conversation. Holden drove Maddie to school in the same pickup. He went to the garage in Roslindale the same as always. On the second Thursday of every month he drove to Dedham and spent the day at the workshop, eating lunch with Frank Lattimore and the apprentices and answering questions about restoration work the way Gary Barrett had answered questions. Directly, without condescension, treating the question as seriously as the person asking it deserved. The apprentices from the Roxbury program, 3 in the first cohort, 7 in the second, had taken to calling him Mr. Barrett without being told to, which he found unnecessary and did not correct. The silver cloud was finished in early November, fully restored, coachwork refinished to the original silver gray, chrome repolished, interior redone in tan leather with the original stitching pattern Sterling had specified when the car was first commissioned. On the evening of the Barrett Mercer Restoration Academy's formal launch, Celeste asked Holden to start the engine before the assembled apprentices, their families, and a small group of board members and investors who had come not because they were required to, but because the story had, over the preceding months, become something people wanted to be part of. Maddie stood beside her father and put her hand flat on the fender, the way she had seen him do it. Holden started the engine. It ran exactly as it had run in the cold garage 6 months earlier, warm, even, unhurried, the sound of something built to last running exactly the way it was built to run. Celeste said, across the hood, with something in her voice as close to unguarded as Holden had ever heard from her, "I told you once, fix it, and the company's yours." Holden looked at her. He said, "No. I just wanted to make sure it belonged to people who know how to listen to it." The engine ran on. Outside, the November cold had settled over the city, and the light from the building caught the silver clouds' restored chrome in a way that made it look, for a moment, not like something old, but like something that had simply been waiting for the right time to arrive. Maddie drew a picture of it that night from memory, and it was the best thing she had ever drawn, and Holden framed it and hung it in the garage at Barrett Classic Works beside the valve cover nuts and the pegboard tools and everything else a person keeps when they understand what keeping means.